Welcome to Pharmacology for Health Professions. Chapter 1 here, we're going to be discussing consumer safety and drug regulations. Upon completing this chapter, the learner should be able to explain what is meant by a drug standard, like what are the standards, discuss historical development in pharmacology, just kind of understand the timeline there. Name the first drug law that was passed in the United States for consumer safety. So what was the name of that law that is focused on consumer safety? Summarize the provisions of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 and its amendments. Define the schedules of controlled substances and differentiate between Control 1 through Control 5 schedules. Compare and contrast the responsibilities of the FDA and the DEA. They each are responsible for different aspects of pharmacology and regulating. Define an orphan drug. What is an orphan drug? And lastly, state several responsibilities you have in administering medications as a direct result of the three major drug laws described in this chapter. So discussing that timeline and talking about drug history, from ancient Egypt till today, pharmacology has advanced how ailments are treated. Okay, the earliest documented pharmacologic example that was found was in the 16th century BE, so way back when, and you know, we've been using herbs and things to treat ailments for a very long time, but there was an evidence of the first actual prescription in the 2nd century BCE. Okay. In 1885, so late 1800s, just before 1900s, we started getting some vaccines. And so the rabies vaccine was developed. Later on, 1897 to 1899, aspirin was discovered and first marketed for use. We still use aspirin today, so it goes to show how good of a discovery that was. Early 1900s, this is when Novocaine was introduced. And prior to that, dental appointments were not as comfortable until 1905. So in 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act passed in the United States, and that's a very important act, and we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. In 1922, we first used insulin. Later in the 20s, the discovery of penicillin. In the 30s, chemotherapy was used to treat cancer for the first time. In 1953, Watson and Crick, they described the structure of DNA, and then we could discuss how DNA interacts with different medications, where some people are more receptive than others. In the 60s is when we got the contraceptive pills. There was a thalidomide crisis where approximately 10,000 babies were born with deformities after thalidomide was used to treat morning sickness. Okay, so this was a drug used in pregnancy, and this led to the passage of the Drug Amendment Act, establishing the Food and Drug Administration in 1962. So they added that amendment there, and we'll talk about that. Also in the 60s, ibuprofen was developed. Okay. Later in the 90s, the FDA approved the first ever treatment for hepatitis C. In the early 2000s, we had the first draft of Human Genome is released to the public, and this sets the stage for genetically targeted drugs. Very specific. 2017, Shingrix vaccine to treat shingles was approved. And then in the 2020s, of course, we had the COVID crisis, and several vaccines were developed during that time in an attempt to mitigate the COVID-19 pandemic. So talking about these drug laws, now we're talking, 1900s in the United States, there were different laws that were passed with regards to dispensing these drugs. Okay, so they're not just available to everyone. Like, how do we decide which ones are prescriptions and which ones are not? Also, drug standards were set in place to assure that customers are getting what they pay for, and that all preparations of the same drug are the same strength, quality, and purity. Okay, so they can be different shapes and sizes, they can be different colors, but they need to be the same strength, quality, and purity. So if you have 10 bottles of Tylenol, you would expect that every Tylenol in that bottle works equally across all 10 bottles. Drug preparations. So drug companies, they must not add any other active ingredients or varying amounts of chemicals to drugs that have already been FDA approved. And then, of course, there's illicit drugs, which there's a lack of enforcement on. There's no controls on the quality, and unfortunately can lead to deaths from overdose. And we see that sometimes when people who are making homemade pills, they have pressers and they're making tablets or adding fentanyl to Percocets and things like that in these pressed pills on the streets, and that it can cause overdoses. And obviously there's no controls on those. So we have the three major acts that we want to discuss in this class, and the first one is the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. The second one is the 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and then it does have a couple of amendments. And the 1970s Controlled Substance Act. All three of these acts really define and determine how we distribute medications today. In 1906, this Pure Food and Drug Act was the first attempt to establish consumer protection in drug and food manufacturing. So this required that drugs met a minimal standard of strength, purity, and quality. So again, they can be different shapes, they can be different colors, they can be different sizes, but the strength, purity, and quality needs to be consistent, and it has to meet these minimal standards. Make sure that that consumer is getting what they're purchasing. This also demanded labeling for preparations containing dangerous ingredients. So it has to have those warning labels on there. And also this established the United States Pharmacopoeia and the National Formulary. And both of those were like an encyclopedia of medications and a way for people to pass information about medications from one person to another. Prior to this, it was simply word of mouth and hand down family physician to physician by word of mouth, and this is a more established directory. So then in 1938, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act had amendments in 1951, 1962, and 1972. Now the FDA is established under the Department of Health and Human Services, and it establishes more specific regulations for preventing adulteration or tampering with of drug, food, and cosmetics. And this also requires they have labels present on certain preparations that say like may cause drowsiness, may cause nervousness, may be habit forming, etc. I know you've probably seen them on bottles. Do not operate heavy machinery while taking this medicine. Don't take on an empty stomach, things like that. So all labels must be accurate. They have to include the active and inactive ingredients of the medication. That's a must. New products must be approved by the FDA before they're released to the public. Warning labels have to be present. We talked about that on the previous slide. So certain drugs must be labeled with the legend or inscription, caution, federal law prohibits dispensing without prescription. So if this is a legend drug, this is a prescription drug and must have this label on it that it is not for over-the-counter use. So thus the term legend drug refers to such preparations. This act also designated which drugs could be sold without a prescription. Okay, so this is the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act. What needs to be a prescription? What can be over the counter? Both prescription and non-prescription drugs must be shown to be effective as well as safe. So they have to meet those drug standards. In 1972, the National Drug Code Directory was established, and this provided the FDA with a list of all drugs manufactured for commercial distribution, and each drug is identified by an NDC number, and this NDC number is made up of 3 parts. So the first part is a 5-digit number that identifies the manufacturer, so that one manufacturer should have that same 5-digit code across all the different kinds of medications that they produce. The second part identifies the drug itself. So you'll see the first 5 numbers, a dash, then you're going to see 4 numbers, and that's going to identify that specific drug in the package. And then the third part is a 2-digit number, and that identifies the package size. So how much is in there, the quantity. So for example, 00406-0123-01 is something you might see. It is not uncommon for the leading zeros to be omitted. So you might actually just see a shortened version of this number, but just know when you see the NDC number that the first part identifies the manufacturer, the second part is the drug, and the third part is the quantity or size in the packaging. So there's an example here. There's a label for aspirin. So this is enteric-coated aspirin. It has the product name, the dose, which is 81 milligrams, the net quantity of contents, so it says how many are in this bottle, and in this particular bottle there's 400 tablets of 81 milligram each aspirin. On the back side of the label, it has the active ingredients, and which says what's in each tablet. It says what the use is for it, and then we have our warning signs. So what are the things that need to be consumers need to be aware of as a warning? There's an allergy alert, alcohol warning if that's necessary, pregnancy, if indicated, may or may not be on the label, keep out of the reach of children, and directions, and then any other pertinent information that consumers would need to know. So 1970, they established the Controlled Substances Act, and this was established by the Drug Enforcement Administration, so this is the DEA, and they set tighter controls on a specific group of drugs. Okay, so these are the ones that are most likely to be abused by society. These include depressants, stimulants, psychedelics, narcotics, and anabolic steroids. So they provided guidelines for the 5 schedules of controlled medications, and they're designated by a capital C. So there's Control 1, Control 2, Control 3, Control 4, and Control 5. Additional drug legislation in 1983, the Orphan Drug Act, which is really important, gives financial incentives to develop medication for diseases that affect only a small number of people and are low profitability. So it's to encourage manufacturers to make drugs and make effective medications for people with rare diseases, and will have a low profitability and not just produce drugs that are going to give them a large profit margin. The Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1990. So this mandates that all over-the-counter drugs must be documented as part of a medical record. So when patients come in and they tell us what medications they're on, not only do we want to know what prescription medications they're on, but we also want to know any over-the-counter drugs that they may be taking. Pharmacists provide drug use review and patient counseling. Sometimes we have drugs that interact with each other, and we will talk about that later this semester. So, quick knowledge check on the things that we just talked about. Which of the following ensures that consumers actually get what they pay for? Okay, so what says that they're going to get what they pay for, that each drug is going to have the same effect? Is it the Federal Drug Administration? B, the Drug Enforcement Agency? C, is it drug standards? Or D, the Pure Food and Drug Act? Which of the following ensures that customers get what they pay for? And that is going to be C, and that's drug standards. Remember, the drug standards set that they're going to be effective and that they're pure, and they can be different shapes and sizes, but they all need to have the same standards as far as each one working as well as the next. Which act provides funding for pharmaceutical companies to develop medications to treat diseases that only affect a small number of people? So keep this in mind. Small number of people are affected. It's got a low profitability. Which act says that manufacturers still need to produce these medications and actually gives them funding to do so? So is it the Controlled Substance Act of 1970? Is it the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1990? Is it the 1983 Orphan Drug Act? Or the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act? So think about that for a minute. And that is going to be the Orphan Drug Act, okay, of 1983. Which is a legal limitation for a Class 2 drug? And the important information here is that it's a controlled substance, right? So that's really what the focus is on here. What is a legal limitation for a controlled drug? A, no refills without a prescription. B, may be refilled 5 times in 6 months. C, not approved for medical use in the United States. Or D, may lead to moderate dependence. So these are the controlled drugs. These ones require a prescription, so no refills without a new written prescription. Most drugs in the controlled substances categories cannot be put on a regular refill. Someone cannot be prescribed, say, Percocet with a 12-month supply of refills. There needs to be reevaluation and a new refill, a new prescription for every refill. So the FDA, they oversee testing and proposed new drugs before they're released into the US market. Now, drugs have to be FDA approved. I take that back. They do not have to be FDA approved, but would be recommended that you're using a drug that is FDA approved. And once it is FDA approved, manufacturers cannot add or take away from the active ingredients inside of this drug. The FDA also is responsible for inspecting plants where foods, drugs, medical devices, or cosmetics are made. So they actually go into these manufacturing companies, into their warehouses, and do surveys on how they are manufacturing these drugs. They review new drug applications and petition for food additives. So they make the decisions on whether or not this is going to be approved, to be regulated. Investigating and removing unsafe drugs from the market. So if they find that drugs have been advertised improperly or are targeting a particular group of people and ends up having adverse side effects, they can investigate that and remove the unsafe drug from the market if needed. The FDA also ensures proper labeling of food, cosmetics, and drugs. And we talked about that, right? The proper labeling, making sure that what do they have on those proper labels? Warnings, active and inactive ingredients, directions, any other pertinent information. So the FDA wants to make sure all those things are actually happening when drugs are put out onto the market. Now, the Drug Enforcement Agency, so the DEA, they are only concerned with controlled substance drugs. Okay, so these are your control 1 through 5. Um, they're the drugs that have high susceptibility for addictive properties. So this enforces laws against drug activities, including illegal drug use, dealing, and manufacturing. So they're the ones that enforce the laws against this. So if there is a provider that is writing prescriptions for someone who is then knowingly then taking those and selling them on the streets, the DEA would be the one to enforce the laws against that kind of drug use and activity. And they also monitor the need for changing the schedules of abused drugs. If a drug shows that it can be more addictive than originally thought, they can change the class, the schedule of that classification of drug as needed, up or down. So now let's check on that. When we talked about the FDA and the DEA, right? They're two different agencies. So what is the responsibility of the Drug Enforcement Agency? This is just the DEA. Now they're responsible for just that single group of drugs I was talking about. So is it A, reviewing new drug applications and petitions for food additives? Is it B, monitor needs the need for change of schedules based on the abused drugs? Is it C, inspecting plants where food, drugs, medical devices, or cosmetics are made? Or D, ensuring proper labeling of food, cosmetics, and drugs? Options A, C, and D are all responsibilities of the FDA, but B is the responsibility of the DEA, and that is the need for changing the schedules of abused drugs based on the need. So healthcare professionals and the law and ethics. Okay, so as a healthcare professional, you must act ethically when ordering and dispensing medication to patients. You'll have the responsibility of keeping accurate records of the medications dispensed and maintaining a supply of drugs at your facility. In addition to that, the following guidelines should be followed by healthcare professionals when dispensing medications. You should have a current drug reference source readily available at all times. This way you can use your drug guide, drug book, or maybe it is an ebook in the computer to be able to research and identify the medications that you're giving so you understand why you're giving them. Keep controlled substances locked securely or double locked, which means they need to be in a locked safety box, and then placing the locked box in a cupboard that is also locked. And conceal and secure prescription pads at your office, clinic, or facility. These prescription pads should not just be sitting out on the desktop for anybody to kind of walk by and just take. They need to be put away, either locked in a med room or in a locked drawer with limited access. Keep accurate records of each controlled substance administered, received, or destroyed at your facility, and keep those records for at least 2 years. It is your responsibility to make sure that you document if you are administering, say, a narcotic. You're going to administer the narcotic. You want to document that you've given it, that it was received by the patient, and if you need to waste it, it should be verified with another person and needs to be recorded that it was destroyed at your facility. Be responsible for keeping up to date with the current news of the activities of the FDA and DEA. Should at least know what the FDA is and what the DEA is and any kind of new changes that are about within their agencies. Local pharmacists are great resources. You want to establish a working rapport with them. Now, if you work in an office and maintain a professional rapport with the pharmaceutical representatives who leave drug samples there, while it's important to establish a professional rapport with them, it's equally important to be aware of the ethical dilemma that may occur when receiving gifts, rewards, or compensated in any way for prescribing a certain medication. So there's something called the Sunshine Act, which requires reporting on compensation and gifts paid to physicians by pharmaceutical representatives. Sometimes that's even considered if the pharmaceutical representatives come in and bring lunch, if they have giveaways, or if they offer a certain bonus incentive to the physicians, that would be unethical and could be reported according to the Sunshine Act to the FDA. So now let's check on what we just discussed in these previous few slides. Healthcare professionals are responsible for which of the following guidelines related to medications? A, keeping controlled substances locked securely. B, keeping a current drug reference source available. C, keep accurate records of all controlled substances administered, received, or destroyed at your facility. Or D, all of these things. What are the healthcare professionals' responsibilities? And that would be D, all of those things. So you are responsible for all of those things. If you have access to your ebook or you have the hard copy of the book, please read this chapter. At the end, I would like you to do a self-assessment. What can you do to improve your knowledge and understanding of the 5 schedules of controlled substances? Which misconceptions and facts about drug therapies and facts about drugs did you find most surprising or interesting? I would really like to know that. How do medication labels shown in the chapter satisfy the requirements of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 and its amendments? So when you see these labels and the aspirin label that's in this PowerPoint slide, how does that satisfy the requirements of the FDA? What are they looking for?